Okay, so in this tutorial, we'll be learning a method called coil building. So here's an example of a bowl that's been coil built, and you can see that the coils of clay that we build up creates like a nice pattern in the side of the object, and it's really nice and decorative. This is a technique that you can use to build vases also, but you would blend all the coils, whereas today we're going to leave them visible and make them kind of decorative. It's just a really nice kind of way of designing the surface of your pot with the clay rather than like a decoration on the top. So let's get started. So the first step with this coil building technique is we're going to line our bowl with paper. This just creates a barrier so that the clay doesn't get stuck inside the bowl because it's wet, and it also means that you can lift it out more easily when it's dry. So I'm just going to put the paper over the top and kind of push it in, and then you can either spray water, or I'm just going to dab it a little bit to get it wet and to push it inside the bowl. So try and get it nice and wet so that there's not big obvious kind of creases in the paper, because they will mark your clay. Okay, so that's ready. And we're gonna move on to making the coils. The first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna take our clay and we're gonna take a little bit off to make our first coil. So to make your coil, it's a little bit fiddly and takes a little bit of practice, but it should become kind of second nature. So I'm just gonna kind of roughly turn it into a kind of sausagey coil shape. It doesn't have to be smooth at this point because we'll do that in a second. Okay, so it's like this. At this stage, you can actually give it a little twist, and that just helps distribute the clay a bit more evenly so that when we roll it out, it's nice and even. So you want a good section of your surface to work on with this, because we're going to kind of move quite a lot with it. So we've got our coil. Again, fingertips aren't great on clay because they leave ridges, so we're going to try and use our palms more so, and we're just going to literally roll the clay up and down, creating a nice coil. If your coil gets a bit long, you can just cut it in half or pinch it in half and then just carry on working on it. And I guess you kind of want it to be about 5 mil, maybe a little bit more. We don't want to make our coils too thin because they're more likely to snap when they're dry. So as you can see on the example here, I've kept them all relatively thick just to make them stronger because we're not firing this clay. And when I'm rolling the coil, I'll move my hands kind of up and down so that it's becoming nice and even, because if you just roll one bit, it might get really thin and then it'll get thicker in another bit and it'll be kind of hard to work with. So just keep moving your hands to keep it nice and even. Yeah, that's kind of what you're looking for your coil, really. Nice and even, nice and smooth, it hasn't cracked. If it does start to crack, you can just take a damp sponge and just wet it off a little bit and it will stop that kind of surface cracking. Okay, so we've rolled our coil and that's our first step. I'm gonna now wet it a little bit. This will help it stick together when we form it into our shape. So just a damp sponge lightly on the surface, like so, and then I'm going to form it into a nice spiral shape. So I just start at the middle and then kind of create the first curve, and then you just kind of push it round. Try to be gentle because you want to keep the lines of the spiral. If you press it together too hard, you might lose some of that and blend it too much. And so I'm just going to keep spiraling it round. And you'll see that where you've wet the surface, it's really helping it all to stick together nicely. Hopefully it will be a similar kind of size to the bottom of my bowl as well. And then with that end of your coil, we're just gonna blend that together a little bit to help it stick and so that it doesn't crack. So that's our first coil. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it into the bottom of the bowl, and that's going to create a nice kind of firm surface for us to build the coils on top of. So I'm happy with that. It kind of almost fills the bottom. What I might do is just press it down a little bit to create a nice kind of slightly flatter bottom, so that when we put the next coil on top, it'll sit nicely on top of that coil. Okay, so the next step is to add our next coil. I'm gonna put a nice solid coil on top of this one to create a nice strong structure, and then we can put some more decorative ones on top. Before we do that, we just need to wet the coil that's going, the coil that's already in the bowl, so that it sticks nicely to the next one. So a nice wet paintbrush, not too wet, just to wet the clay a little bit. And then I'm going to take my coil and I'm just going to build it on top of the one I've already put in there. So it's just going on the inside of the bowl, around the edge. And then with the end, you can just pinch that off and then just use your finger to blend it together. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to press my thumb against that coil that we just placed inside the bowl, just to make sure it's stuck to the last coil inside. Okay, so now we've made a nice base for our bowl. It's quite solid, I'm happy with it. The coils are nice and thick and strong. I'm gonna start by making some balls to decorate with. So you can see on my example here that I've done that, and it creates quite a nice pattern to start with. So to do that, I'm just gonna take some of my clay and just roll it around. Again, you don't want them to be too small. If they're too small and fiddly, they're likely to crack or break when it dries. So just keep it all quite nice and chunky. This bowl's kind of going to be decorative. We're not going to put our cereal in it, anything like that. So don't worry too much about that. We're kind of looking to just have some fun and for it to look nice and decorative. So I'm trying to make sure they're even sizing as well, so that we've got like a nice even pattern around the outside. So I've made a few. Before you start putting them on the inside, just remember to wet your paintbrush and then just get that clay that's already there a little bit wet, just because it will help with sticking. Okay, so I'm just going to start placing them on the inside there, and then with your thumb or a lollipop stick, you can just blend them into the clay that's already there. Because on the inside you can kind of do the blending, and then on the outside you'll still have that detail. So don't blend too much, obviously, because you'll lose that detail completely, but we can do a little bit of blending on the inside to make sure that it doesn't crack. You could even dip it in a little bit of water if you are worried about cracking. For example, if your clay does start to feel a little bit dry, just dip it in the water, and that should help with cracking and being able to blend them together. So I'm just going to keep going with these all around the edge, and then we can move on to doing a different style of coil. I'm on my last one, so I'm just going to put that in and make sure it's nice, all even and all blended. And then I can move on to thinking about what I want to do for my next coil. So as you can see, it's all blended on the inside, but you should have retained some of that detail on the outside. And now I'm going to move on to making another coil. So at this stage, you can kind of decide what you want to do. On here, I made 2 coils and then twisted them together, which is a really nice effect. You can make the wriggly one that I've done here, and this is what it looks like on the top. I used that as the kind of rim, which looked quite nice, but you could do it anywhere in your bowl really. So the other thing you could do is just do another straight coil if you wanted to keep the design quite simple. And it's always good to put a coil in between one decorative one and another decorative one, just to make a nice solid line to start again. So that's what I'm going to do on top of the ones that I just made. So I've got a coil here, and again I'm just going to paint the top of those ones. We can blend it once we put it in, but I just want to make sure that every time I put a new coil in, I'm just wetting the clay a little bit to stop it from cracking and giving it a good chance of sticking together. So do that, and then I'll also get a damp sponge on this one. It's important as well not to leave the coils out for too long, because they will dry quickly because they're so thin. And once they start to dry, you'll have cracking, and it's not very fun. So if you are likely to keep them out for a while, either cover them or make sure to keep wetting them as well. So I'm going to put this one on top of the one I've just done. There we go, and then I'm just going to pinch the end off like I did before. So I'm just going to blend that in. You can either use your thumb or finger, but you might also want to use the lollipop stick because it's just a little bit easier sometimes. Don't be afraid to be quite firm here as well, just to get that nice blend of the clay. Okay, so at this stage you can kind of have fun with it, have a little look at the coils here. If there's any that you particularly like, have a go at making those. And there's also lots of really great tutorials online where you can have a look at what other people have done, and just make sure that you build all the way up to the rim of your bowl, and make sure you dry it slowly so that there's less chance of cracking. So we're going to spray with a little bit of water, or get your wet sponge and just kind of wet the clay a little bit, and then again we're going to cover it with plastic just to make sure it doesn't dry out too quickly. After a couple of days you can take the plastic off and then let it dry completely, and once it's dry completely you should just be able to lift it out of the bowl with the paper really easily, and then you can peel the paper off and it reveals your finished bowl. So it should look really satisfying and have all the coil detail in there. If you find that it's blended a bit too much and you want to have another go and just try blending it a little bit less so that you retain some of that detail. So that is coil building. I hope you enjoyed it, and just take your time, try and relax with it, and you should be able to enjoy it more that way.